Yeah, and people are just I'm gonna continue to look at stuff. Cataloging rights.
I just wanted to get started playing up. Instead of doing it tomorrow, I'd rather do it tonight than tomorrow.
All right, I think we're gonna get going. Should we dim the lights, or is it okay? Welcome to the second part of the lecture series for the Catalyst. I will speak briefly about the work that we're gonna see. I will just improvise to see if I can make these two things belong together. That's the basic gesture of avant-garde, is to try and make two things that don't belong together seem as if they are part of the same story. So we'll see. I think the work that we see today, both from Alan and from Lida, is like a probe into an environment that always is larger than the object itself. So it's outside of the common perception, usually. So the environment could be the mediatic realm or the socio-spatial realm of life, or broadly the environment of the material commons, or the environment could be the digital logistical infrastructure that reassures the seamlessness of today's material immaterial economy, right? So work probes into this environment, and in being a probe into that environment, which you can never really perceive on a palm of your hand as a direct object of cognition, the work changes the status of the material that's used in its making, because material belongs right there in front of you in the work, but it also belongs in some sort of realm of rhythms, and logistics. It's always mediating between here and some larger sort of condition. And if we pay closer attention, then we start noticing the friction and the frictionless qualities of the environment or the mediums in which the work is situated. The smooth, seamless, and untroubled by the physical constraints versus the one that's constrained both physically, socio-spatially, politically, etc. So just some ideas giving context. Maybe the story that you tell about your work is completely different, which is completely fine. Just my reading of knowing broadly. Our first speaker today is Lida Aguiar. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. Do you want to start? You want to start? Okay. Well, we'll start. My idea was to start with you, but let's start with Alan. Then Alan Sayek, he'll start today. He's an architect, designer, and educator, and principal of Invivia, an award-winning global design firm. He is an associate professor in practice at Harvard Graduate School of Design and the director of REAL, the Responsive Environment and Artificial Lab at Harvard. And then after Alan, Lida will speak about the work of the Stock A studio, which is what you lead, right? Lida's research and design work has been exhibited at Storefront for Art and Architecture, Milan Architectural Week, A+D Museum, amongst other places. Lida comes to us from the University of Michigan School of Architecture. Moderating today will be Mike Christensen, the Director of Graduate Studies here at the U of M School of Architecture, and also the principal architect at the award-winning architectural firm Design and Energy Laboratory. And along with Mike, it seems to be, I'll be the next moderator, unless Athar joins us, who is the partner of Gabriel Cadaster. You all know him, all know her. Anyhow, join me in welcoming Alan.
Hello. Yep. Thank you, Vahan. Excuse me. I like that avant-garde part that you said that you can connect, because I have trouble connecting my work my different works together to make a narrative. So good luck connecting us. But I'm just kidding. But no, I'm just kidding. But as Vahan mentioned, I wear two hats. Basically, I'm going to talk about my work, and so I had the REAL Lab, which is the Responsive Environments and Artifacts Lab at Graduate School of Design at Harvard, and I have my studio in Vivia, which is a few blocks from the GSD. So I spent my time between the two places. And the work that I do kind of complements each other, and in some ways it's different. So I'm going to show maybe about, depending on the time, about 5 projects today, 5 to 6 projects, and then we can have a discussion. So I guess some of the things that fascinate me is about really understanding environments, measuring different qualities of environments. For example, when I say what I mean by that, we can measure the dimensions of the space, the temperature, the slope of the seats, the color, everything we can measure it, and architects are very good at that. We can represent that and then we can recreate things because how we can measure. But there are things that we're learning how to measure, and what I'm interested in, and what I explore in my lab is measuring almost the ambience of the place, the vibe of the place, and if, like for example, are you all interested in my talk? I'm kind of like, I have no idea why you're here, or so these types of questions are really interesting for me, and if there are any type of implications to architecture, and if we can learn from those, and then if architecture affects these types of questions. So it's pretty, in the lab at least, what I do, the work is pretty open-ended in that sense, and it's about trying to find new ways of measuring and new ways of understanding, and creating some correlations. So I'm going to show some of that. And in my practice, I still do the same things, and I ask what-if questions, like what if we have something that represents this, and which can take a public, like a public art form, or it can be completely different things. And each experiment, there are different experiments that I play with. And like, what if we have something in this space that can represent what you're feeling, or what if we have a I don't know, cloud over a city that tells us the mood of the city. So these are the types of things that I come up with sometimes, and sometimes it's just a call for something. So there's no direct way of doing my project. So each project is a very one-off, and I'm going to show a few of these also. So in short, basically, I do experiments, and I do this public art, or I don't call myself an artist. So it's this large-scale projects that show these types of questions, that reveal. And I talk about also, because of this, I'm in this, not a one defined, I guess maybe it's a therapy thing. This basically, I always am very conscious about the methods that I use. So that's why I write a lot about methods, design methods. So these are the 3 things that I do, and some of the work that I'm not going to show. I work with different corporations, sometimes even about thinking about how different design methods can help you design in different ways. So those are the three hats that I wear. So I'm going to talk about the experiments initially. So again, as I mentioned, these are the two things that I do. So I understand environments, and I use these technology. I use technologies to understand the environment and then recreate different things. So by understanding what I mean, there are these, and this is the type of things that we do in the lab. We have a lot of biometric sensing, eye tracking, different off-the-shelf type of sensing material, that equipment or technologies that we can use. We don't, and we build our own sometimes. And we try to sense new types of things, or build on previous assumptions and knowledge. And we work a lot with psychologists and social scientists. So those are the area that we work with. So to give you an example, so this is one, and some of them don't go anywhere. Some of them, sometimes we write papers, scientific papers. So this is an experiment, basically just the student had to sense the stress levels, to think about proxemics, like how far, if spatial qualities basically have any implications to stress levels. So with this emotive thing device, basically you can create a baseline of your stress and then walk around the city in different modes and then see if there are different proximity, different distances from you are causing any type of anxiety. And if you do this over a long period of time and understand different, you can create this, you can create a clear data basically and understand if there's a real correlation between proximity and stress levels. So similarly with eye tracking, so this is another example looking at the eye, where the eye looks basically, where the pupil looks in the environment. And we took this outside the lab and on the street. This is Quincy Street in front of the Graduate School of Design. And basically we had students walk and just see what they're looking at and what they're remembering and what they're seeing. So there's this distinction between when you look at something and what you're seeing and what you're remembering. And these are, of course, a lot of these ideas. I mean, Kevin Lynch had a lot of in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of talk about these ideas of psychogeography and trying to understand the environment through and using psychology basically and cognitive science to bring cognitive science to the understanding of the city. So with these tools, we can validate some of these questions, but also we can see sometimes a lot of, in this case, basically we did all these studies to really understand if what people are seeing, even to look at the differences between the locals and visitors, because visitors usually tend to look at new things. Because you're not, as a tourist, you look at everything, but when you live in a place, you don't see things anymore because you just get blinded by that. But there's this at the end of the day. I mean, you can be very critical of this. There's this fundamental notion of what you're looking at. Maybe it's not what you're thinking about. So it's suddenly the whole thing collapses. But that's part of the lab, basically, just to come up with these questions to understand. So we have this very scientific method of doing it, but maybe sometimes the results are not that conclusive. So similarly with colors, basically this is another example with looking at the colors in the city and then looking at correlation between stress levels and if there is some sort of a correlation between looking at the colors of the environment and how we feel. So of course we publish papers with the findings and again with vibrations and correlations with vibrations and sounds. I'm not going to go too much into the details, but you understand about this idea of perception, cognition, and trying to find correlations between how we understand the environment. So these are all from the work, from the lab. We do a lot of, again, this is looking at the temperature or the airflow in the space. Again, a student created this device. So I'm going to go quickly through here. And here, looking at different modes of understanding the playing with senses, basically. So a lot of the experiments and the work that we do fall under these categories, basically. And we write a lot of papers. So that's my lab. So coming back to the question of if we have a cloud that senses the mood of the place. So you might recognize this city. It's right here. Minneapolis. So this was basically we created a cloud that senses the mood of Minneapolis. This was about 4 or 5 years ago. I don't know if anybody saw this. So this was for 3 months in front of the convention center, right? So the idea is very simple. It's basically, at the time, it was looking at just 4,000 keywords from Twitter feed, basically, and looking at doing a sentiment analysis of the text and looking if the city is stressed out or it's calm. So just looking at the whole mood of the place. And of course, to build something like that, you say, okay, I want to make a cloud. It just creates this huge, suddenly you have to deal with the wind, the structure, all the technicalities. You have to program this. It becomes a huge project that almost like you're dealing with a complete architectural project, because you said, okay, I want to create a cloud that senses the mood. So it starts like that, but it just creates all these other components that you have to deal with in many, many different ways. And also the cloud basically cooled the space under it. So it created basically a space out of a place that was, or place out of a space that was in front of the Minneapolis Convention Center. So it's a very simple idea, but again, it created this gathering place under this cloud. So I do similar type projects. I'm going to show you a couple of different ones. So this is another one. It's this is in New York. This was 2 years ago, and it's called Pulses. Basically, it just the idea is to feel the noise generated by police communication with your body. So basically, you feel it's a bench. It's a big, maybe it's a sculpture. Or it's a bench. It's a big sculptural bench that you lie on, and it vibrates. Again, taking data from New York and the communication, the police communication, and then so basically you feel that the stress or the tension of the place with your body. To do this, again, you have to deal with this is in concrete, so we have to deal with this very thin, all sorts of construction. It's fiber reinforced concrete, and the kids started running on it, and but it just again, it's this idea that comes that okay, we want to create this, and then engage with technology, understanding the technology, and visualizing almost the data in a body-centric or body reactive way. So this is this is in Petrosino Square in Soho. Actually, it was there for 3 weeks. So I'm going to go. This is in front of the GST when we're making it. We had it there, so with the snow on it. But again, doing something like this, it takes. I always say, why am I doing this? But it takes a lot of time, a lot of time and energy, and but then it creates this one interesting experience. But then again, it's an experiment that I just move on basically to something else. This is another project. This was a competition for at Harvard. But it shows these different layers of technology, and this is a Harvard project.
As you step out of your freshman dorm on the way to your morning lecture, you come upon this. A monumental, pure alabaster globe perches delicately on a patch of grass. The simple structure exudes an air of serenity, but when you approach the sphere and rest your hand on its shell of polished concrete, you can sense the surface glowing, trembling gently underneath your palm, pulsating to the constant flux of energy in Harvard Yard. This is Aura, an on-campus art installation to bring to the freshman student body mindfulness about energy and resource consumption in the 17 freshman dorms of Harvard College. The main component of Aura features a hollow concrete sphere of 8 feet in diameter, securely installed on the northern section of the old yard. The sculpture is made of biodynamic cement, an innovative material that when exposed to sunlight can break down smog in the air. Embedded into this biodynamic cement are thousands of fiber optic threads that extend all the way to the center.
From here, but you get the sense that, again, doing something like this where it has, so this is also, it's a part of a research that's being done about bringing mindfulness to the energy consumption in campus, basically. If having something externalized like this can with the Langer lab at Harvard, Ellen Langer is this expert on mindfulness. So basically, that's it's again collaboration with the psychologists in this project. But again, the idea is to create this externalized way of understanding the energy of the place and perhaps affecting the student body in a. Creating some sort of a feedback that can create mindfulness in energy consumption. So it has an associated app with it, and it has the whole narrative that again I will skip on that. This is another project. This is in Copenhagen in Kulturvet Square, and this was an empathy catcher, let's say. So this idea is the idea that this you can send empathy messages to this sculpture and empathetic messages, and then it reacts to it. So the reason I'm showing this project because it became a very interesting. So this was. Coinciding with the 100th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. This was 2015, and so basically when I landed in Copenhagen just a week before opening, there was this on the main saying that the country Turkey is very angry at this sculpture. So I had no idea when this was when I was doing it. It will open up this all this because it was the mayor of Copenhagen with the Armenian ambassador that had Armenian ambassador to Copenhagen that had asked me to do this. So. But the interesting thing that came out of this, regardless of how this whole thing worked, again, externalizing some, this had, the idea of this was to create empathy, basically. It was, eventually, basically, it created debate in the parliament in Denmark, and there was a vote about recognition of the Armenian genocide, which was part of this, which was quite interesting as a physical piece that could generate that kind of conversation. So in that sense, I find this project interesting, not particularly in terms of the form, but the form was about, again, it opened and closed according to the messages that it got. Another project, and each one of these projects are slightly different, but they all have some sort of a, again, all my projects deal with the physical place, some materiality, and some sort of a human perception. I think that's psychology is I'm very interested in psychology on different levels, basically. This is a project in Calgary that is called Familiar Strangers, and it's still ongoing. It's been going on for 3-4 years now. It should open this year, I hope. So this idea is this is a permanent installation that talks about there's this large underpass in Calgary that is about 300 feet that the city wanted to revitalize. I worked this with my colleague from Harvard, Krzysztof Wodiszko, who's a media artist also, and we came up with this idea of familiar strangers, and that's the title of the installation, and which is the idea of familiar strangers is this: when these strangers that you see on your daily commute, for example, they look familiar, you know them, but they're still strangers to you. So, this underpass is about during the day and during night. It's like in rush hour. Basically, it's constantly there are pedestrians going like commuting to their work. So the concept that we came up with is to create this large. These are tests done during installation. It's not up yet, but it should be up very soon. So it's about 300 feet. That basically on both sides of the underpass, that basically it creates a reverse mirror of your silhouette. So basically, if I'm walking this way, I see somebody else. I see my silhouette approaching me on the other side. So basically, we meet in the middle. So it's a reverse mirror. It's just to create this notion of. It's about slowing down people basically there and creating conversation, reacting with your silhouette and seeing other people's silhouette. But the idea is to see how other people see you, because it's this idea of the reverse mirror. When you see yourself, it's different how other people see you. It's as simple as that. The notion of this. So again, just this idea, it just creates. It's been going on for 4 years. It creates all sorts of problems to deal with a project like this. But again, you start with this simple idea. Okay, let's put a cloud or let's create this reverse mirror. But then it just it's a huge. It becomes a huge undertaking. And the last project that I just started, like working on, and this is for Vahan. This is especially for you. This is in Yerevan, Armenia, so I met this professor recently that had been assigned to be the head of the Yerevan Physics Institute in Armenia. And I didn't know what this was, and and she asked me, why don't you come and let's do something there and help revitalize this space. So I went there and not knowing what this place was, so I found out that, so Yerevan Physics Institute was, during Soviet times, basically, when Armenia was assigned as a science place. So Soviet Union assigned different countries. Georgia did wine, Armenia did science. So this was the idea, basically. So Armenia was very strong in the sciences. And so there was this physics institute that did very high-end, very, very cutting-edge quality physics research. Since then, basically, I found that lots of papers have been published, lots of, and they have these two particular accelerators that are, and it was cutting, so it had about 6,000 to 7,000 researchers during the Soviet period, but when it collapsed, the Soviet Union collapsed and Armenia got its independence, it went from 5,000 to 6,000 researchers to 300 researchers. So the place looked completely like abandoned. It's almost like post-apocalyptic. You go there, like it's quite completely fascinating place. So it looks like this, but there are people still working there. So there are these 300 very dedicated researchers, physics researchers working. And this person has been working there since the 70s, and they're extremely dedicated. They love the place, and but this is the place. So, this is just this last summer, basically, and the director said, "Okay, what can you do with all this place? Like, how can we revitalize this place?" So her job is to restart the accelerator, which she has managed to do that. But again, in terms of economics, it's a very complex situation because there are these 82 buildings that are Soviet buildings, somewhere between the number of 72 to 82 buildings that are partially used, partially abandoned, and it's completely overgrown landscape. And but the idea is to restart the physics part, and then the economy of Armenia, what's happening with it is a lot of the the economy is being driven by technology. So to bring technology, to make it almost like a science and technology campus. So that's the idea of so like any grandiose or megalomaniac architect. So I said, okay, why don't we do this huge thing, like this huge 1.8 kilometer loop around this that connects, it creates a place basically, and connects this camp, because right now they're all scattered. So we'll start with that, and it goes through buildings, it cuts through the buildings, and it creates this it's a landscaping strategy basically with media integrated. So that's the idea, and we created a dozen of images. But what it did, which was very nice, now the World Bank is interested in it, and we have a meeting with the World Bank in June. So that's the story. So just the image, creating this, and the idea was to create this spine, a circular spine, media spine that can start the development of this pretty unique, very unique, and very crazy project, basically. So I just wanted to go through these random projects, and then which made me come back to this. So this nice gentleman sitting there, I started thinking, what am I doing? What do I do? Like, I had an existential crisis after he showed this. So I took a picture of this, and And I started to see if I fit somewhere there in one of those, but luckily this was blurry, so I couldn't make up. So I thought, okay, this is perfect. Maybe there's another way of looking at this when things get blurry a little bit. Maybe we can have that as a discussion. I don't know. So I just wanted to leave it here. Thank you.
Start the conversation right there. Just worth mentioning that prior to joining academia as an assistant professor at University of Michigan recently, I designed stage sets and moving infrastructures for touring musicians, which will become very apparent, I think, in my work. And I also kind of struggle to situate myself within that diagram, so we can kind of go back to that diagram at the top of the conversation. I also watch a lot of stand-up comedy, and I decided that until my presentations were as good as the comedy that I watch, that I would have to read. So I prepared a nice sort of big text, but I will be reading today. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting a few projects, all of which kind of fall into one big thematic, which is like material temporalities, and I'll do that sort of in three ways: through returns, through rentals, and through resurfacing. They all ultimately connect to my main interest, which is the kind of tying between logistics and image, or logistics and kind of tectonics. This is my studio, Stocka Studio, which is just me, so it's another name for me. Spam in your inbox, junk in your mailbox, pay for storage, shop per pound. All the drawers are full, yet there are items in the cart. We're in a moment characterized by hyperabundance, both material and virtual. Even not having much can be characterized by having too much stuff or junk or trash. Circulated by ever-tightening culture commodity loop, which makes what is culture today product tomorrow, trash the next. This excess is a main cause for social inequity and environmental problems alike. From the warehouse to the domestic interior, architecture is implicated in all aspects of this loop. I show you here the main headquarters for Uline, which is one of the big providers for hardware in architecture and for kind of auxiliary items in architecture. And I like the contrast of this sort of aesthetic that they chose for their headquarters, for the front of their headquarters, which is the building here in the parking lot, with the big warehouse in the back, which is, sort of also tied to the presentations yesterday, a kind of manifestation of an Excel sheet on landscape format, perhaps. So often as intermediary between materials and materialism, where resources are put in the service of keeping up with interior design trends, inventory fluctuations, or fads, to be in this now times is to embody the socio-material circumstances where a new downstairs bathroom Pinterest folder is directly linked to sales of penny tiles, and what is considered cute in social media affects material extraction demands in a query halfway around the world. So I get really statementy at the top and then really designy at the bottom. This body of work begins from that abundance, from that excess, the muchness we have produced, and attempts to instill new life from and onto it. So Stock is really interested in responding to this kind of extreme availability of both stuff and images through material circulations. through material circulations and material temporalities. It understands the material world through multipliers, where a thing times many times can be architecture. So not so much concerned with perhaps the embodiment of architecture as a building, but as systems of material proliferation. So this makes me interested in IKEA, UPS, and Alibaba. Stock tends to function within kind of aesthetic low-hanging fruit, right? A lot of screenshots, internet as a kind of resource, often landing on cliches as it sources from just kind of everything that we have around the world. It's particularly interested in foregrounding tectonics and parts, how things move or are put together, arguing that the geopolitical can also be found on a single bolt, or the decision to bolt something versus screwing something. So the work here focuses on three kind of temporalities, or three ways: through reverse logistics, which to me manifest in a kind of design for recirculation, renting and design for disassembly, and resurfacing and a kind of recirculation through aesthetics. And I'll go through a few projects. I'm going to turn this around because I'm uncomfortable looking at it. I'll start with Stock, which is kind of like the project that gave me the namesake. It's a project that started in 2015. Stock is a construction material and texture representation project that became a kind of thing on Instagram. I'm not quite sure why yet, but it did. It was created by leveraging big box store returns on a $200 returning credit. So I would buy materials from big box stores, stage them at my home, photograph them, and drive them back to return them. So the project explored common documentation techniques found in construction material catalogs and reconstituted them into an alternative catalog, right? It's a catalog of the catalog. Concerned with the act of accumulation, the project consisted of the labor of sifting, combining, transporting, and organizing both images and materials. But what Stock really proposed was a method of producing a lot from very little, often proposing entire worlds using a single material, texture, or image. To be able to produce work with very little funding using a return policy, the fine print of the commercial contract, to gain access to resources that would otherwise not be within financial reach for me at the time. While at the same time sidestepping some of the larger flaws of the kind of temporary architectural or representational project, which can be waste, funding, storage fees, and replacing these with like sort of my own labor at the time, which I had more available time back then. The proposals engage the off-the-shelf, the ready-made, on their own terms, confronting us with the options of what to do with that which already exists, and imbuing newness rather than produce a new kind of recurring theme in my work. Stock deploys many of the commercial gimmicks, fetishizing objects through portraiture, studio lighting, and calculated backdrops, yet it offers no added commercial value. So no more or less cinder blocks or flexible PVC pipes were sold in any given month because of Stock. The project became a kind of template for a number of future projects and an emblem of the kind of scrappy, resource-limited approach to architecture that my studio has become kind of known for. Which also made me interested in this kind of larger field of reverse logistics that returns kind of belong to. Reverse logistics are essentially all operations or management after the delivery of the product to the consumer. Remanufacturing and refurbishing are can also be included as part of this, but I'll focus on returns here. So to give you a sense of the scale of reverse logistics, brick and mortar returns, those are physical returns, are about 8 to 10% of all transactions. E-commerce is 20% of all transactions, holiday e-commerce 30%, and very expensive products 50%. For manufacturers, this can account for almost 15% of their revenue that is spent on returns. These are huge numbers, but yet returns are a kind of new normal. From the company's end, returns are typically understood as the cost of doing business, and they're simply folded into their losses until recently. With the e-commerce boom, returns have obviously skyrocketed, and reverse logistics have become a huge industry, with many companies starting to even profile and even ban certain types of returners, like the fitting roomer, or the fitting roomer who is the person that buys a bunch of stuff knowing that they'll return all but one, or the wardrobers, those who buy things to use once and then return. So stock would have been a kind of material wardrober. E-commerce's dilemma, though, is that, as opposed to the physical returns, e-commerce's dilemma is that the most profitable customers are also those who return the most. So they buy and return the most. Therefore linking profit with the doubling of the kind of environmental impact of shipping. So generally speaking, businesses streamlining their reverse logistics is a really good thing. As weak reverse logistics lead to avoidable waste, with many companies until recently not knowing how to handle returns and essentially directly discarding these return items. So to show you just how recent some of these kind of interests in return logistics are, Home Depot is like one of the companies that's being most celebrated for jumping in on this. And since they have like 2,500 stores. And since 2015, they've opened 4 centralized locations to handle their reverse logistics, meaning like centers that can get some of these returns, like assess them and figure out sort of what to do with them, as opposed to sending them directly to a landfill if they were not in shelvable, recirculatable quality, which is a high threshold for an object when it comes back from the customer. So in 2018, then I became really interested in shipping. In 2018, I did a research fellowship at Michigan, where I completed a project interested in this kind of e-commerce called Careful Crates, A Culture of Shipping. Logistics have transcended their origination as pragmatic instruments and have become socio-logistical modes of operating, changing everything from our infrastructure to our habits. At a global scale, shipping and handling operates as part of the abstract black box data space of managed quantities and collapsed distances, where all material fragments get reduced to a bounding box with a tracking number, a data point, in the matrix of contemporary infrastructures. But at the human scale, it's palpable. There are cardboard boxes on the porch, the logging needed to access the order's tracking number, the neighbor who signed for it in your absence, the color is wrong, the size doesn't fit, send it back. Negotiating the exchange between these global and human scales are boxes, crates, containers, and other armatures of commodity mobility that are simultaneously material and immaterial, object and system. They're material insofar as they are actual containers with a physical form, but also immaterial in that they cannot be disassociated from the informational traces that they bear. The box is the logistical unit of the material world. The bounding box, the metric of spatial thinking, a subliminal force in the construction of space, a form of thought, an ordering system, an icon. These transport containers bind, shelter, and delimit content in anticipation of an economically bound spatial exchange, one that constantly attempts to regularize form, square it out, flatten it, standardize it, and turn it into a quantifiable data set. In a system that strives for efficiency, difficulty then becomes an act of resistance, and a shape, a potential act of irreverence. So the formal plasticity of these careful crates contradicts the optimizations of standardized shipping units and serve as material resistance to this kind of bounding box economy that neutralizes contents in anticipation of global circulation. In shipping's kind of boxy microeconomic logic, the integrity of the perimeter casing and all of the parts that guarantee safe circulation, with its details and protected edges, all of them are economized. Every mistake means money. Negotiating what Walid Bashti calls, quote, the unbearable compromise of that which is portable. In fact, these boxes and units of logistics are so safeguarded that FedEx owns the exact dimensions of a box, has a copyright to not just the design of the box, but a proprietary volume of space, meaning FedEx owns a particular shape. So shipping, of course, has changed the global landscape. So just today, we're hearing a lot of news about Amazon and the coronavirus and like the kind of pandemic. The pandemic was explained as a kind of like, what if Amazon cannot fulfill its orders, right? Like, so instead of visualizing the pandemic as like, what if like a lot of people die, or what if like there's a kind of human condition, it's like, what if Amazon cannot send you your boxes? That was in the New York Times today. How like, it has also changed our relationship to stuff and how we own things. So I argue that shipping has imbued a state of transience on all things. Notions of ownership have been replaced with convenience and timely arrival. The more frictionless the acquisition process, the more intermittent our ownership. Buy and return or sell or move or store or try or replace, not own. Objects perpetually in circulation instill onto us this endemic mobility, not to mention the kind of precarities that come with that mobility. So while focusing on the kind of box as a proxy object, the project led to this kind of bigger sociologistical conclusions about material temporalities, retail, and the use of image in this kind of ubiquity of shipping moment. I'm gonna skip through some of these conclusions, but maybe I'll talk about them after. But I want to focus on sort of what Stock does with some of these bigger topics, which is kind of turn it into like an assemblage proposal or a kind of prototype for how to do architecture or how to do like assemblage differently. Which brings me to circulation assemblages, which is a prototype for a kind of temporary circulation-based material assemblage system by looking at shipping and art handling as a source of inspiration, as they often deal with the kind of transient object. It develops a system of assemblage where components come together while each one maintains their individual integrity in order to have kind of like a likelier future value or utility. So the project begins to develop these by using this kind of, by becoming aware of this kind of object systems or like system objects. These are components that function in the service of other objects, the kind of intermediaries of the material world. Their aim is to maintain a temporary relationship between these materials and components so they can be taken apart, moved around, changed in configuration, or otherwise returned to circulation. So these are edge protectors, cushioning, ratchet straps, zip ties, clamps, connectors, shims, etc., which I believe are becoming the kind of tectonic language of our generation. So here the box is not so much a proposal for the box itself, but it becomes kind of like a testing unit, a prototype, a shape that imbues many of the architectural problems like edges, corners, a way to negotiate the ground, a need to be assembled and kept together for a period of time. So it's just kind of like a perfect kind of 3D test dummy. Designing through rentals, a kit of this some parts, budget gym. This is a project that I just took down in LA this last month, and I moved to New York to a different exhibit. It's an exhibition, video game, and public programming at Materials and Applications in LA. It's a temporary architectural assembly in service of the activity, in this case, the activity of working out. Co-opting formulas from rentable event tents, so think wedding tents and information booths, where poles, panels, tension straps, and tarps complete otherwise generic structural frames. The project intertwines a few custom elements with generic ones and images with budget materials in order to provide a set of parts that ultimately complete a gym. It's a collaboration with a company that does the kind of structural system that actually UPS is their only client. They do the kind of undercarriage. It's like a mom and pop place. They only have one client, and they do all the sort of understructure for the conveyor belts in some of their warehouses. So I convinced them to paint it green, and therefore to cut like less standard sizes than what they're used to, and then all of a sudden this like structural system that they were using for one thing can be used for many things, or that's the kind of argument that I'm making. It turns to material diversion tactics from DIY cultural production, where often low-budget material assemblies are re-aestheticized and reassembled to serve future events. So refinishing the same materials over and over here becomes both an accessible approach to aesthetic renewal as well as an environmental tactic. So resting on the kind of straightforwardness of its base structure, it instead focuses its design agency in developing kind of non-invasive attachments that allow for the dismantling and redistribution of the parts that make this kit serve future uses, while using kind of mild customization approaches, or trying to develop mild customization approaches that use the top image layer as opposed to the whole, as opposed to like affecting the whole object as ways of imposing new aesthetics onto it. So the project proposes assembly, not construction, using rather than owning, refinishing rather than repurchasing, as ways of creating an architectural kit that equally considers its own futurity and aesthetics. So it includes this like structural system, foam padding, water weights to hold it down, tape or tarp for sort of shade and privacy, and tape, tarp for shade and privacy, ratchet straps as structural tie, as well as nuts and bolts, shims as a kind of foundation adjustment, inflatable dunnage bags as furniture and padding, sandbags as counterweights. It's kind of like an architectural microcosm in a way. It also included this kind of prototype for a video game where one can customize these future versions of the project by interacting with the catalog of parts. So the project ultimately became a kind of demo kit, a showroom for a project that ended up becoming Some Parts.Parts, which is an expansion of that project, which is an attempt at an event-based architectural rental business, which consists of a website and a set inventory of structural and auxiliary items that we adapt to have many potential scales and uses, from furniture to parties, and from birthdays to like stage sets. So the project's initial interest was to try to kind of instrumentalize the gallery space from the prior project, which often deals in an economy of exposure and conceptual thinking, in order to launch an actual sort of material business. So Some Parts uses this modular system that we've already seen me use, and proposes to provide a more aestheticized yet less branded version of an already existing market of event-based architecture, right? So think like the white-on-white wedding tents that are everywhere, or the Heineken stage set as the like hyper-branded version of that. So this kind of falls as an aesthetic in between, or at least argues that there's a lot of aesthetic in between to work through. So it relies on disassembly and budget customization methods, which we've seen before, and it very much leans on standard sizes. All the cuts have been like standard sized, and we just essentially maximize what we can do with those standard cuts. As a result of those standard cuts, we end up with a lot of standard dimensions where I can essentially look up anything that is 1 foot by 1 foot, and it can be part of the kit. So the dimensions become this kind of searchable criteria through which anything can be incorporated into the kit. So since then, I'm going to go a little bit faster. There's just one more project left. Since then, it's had quite a few iterations, including a recent stage set for 15 performers and a performance of like 500 people in an audience in Berlin, in a place that would not allow us to document. Therefore, the cheeky no JPEG representation of the project, in which it was an international logistical sort of endeavor to send all this stuff. So in this case, the kit is made of aluminum, the padding is made of foam, CNC'd foam, and vacuum-formed panels, in order to have it be something that could be shipped and can be flat-packed into 5 luggages of the performers, yet can still fill an entire venue that has 500 people in it. So it was a series of sort of blankets and structures. And so the last project, through surface recirculation, through aesthetics, I'll go through this one really quickly. It's a work in progress for like fall of 2020 as part of a group exhibition at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit, which is coming up in the fall. The project is called Post-Commodity Services. It's a proposal for a business that offers radical resurfacing service to clients. So I'm essentially buying a bunch of storage units from people around Detroit and radically redecorating them through recycled rubber spray. So it speculates on the afterlife of stuff, unwanted stuff. It wants the stuff in your storage unit and proposes to radically resurface it as a way to reinvent it and bring it back into circulation, a kind of hardcore interior decor. It proposes spraying, wallpapering, dipping all your unwanted objects in perpetuity as an aesthetic layering and renewal for your home, office, etc. So that's the sort of general thing for the business. For the exhibition at MOCAD, it's going to be specifically granulated rubber. The project places itself between the culture that produces the desires for newness and the infrastructures that are in place to handle the discard produced by those desires, and attempts to create new economic and aesthetic loops between those two ends, producing new value from that which is existing, that which we have chosen to produce by changing its image, surface, while keeping the material core intact. So the laminating the image from the sort of the rest of the material strata is the key kind of proposal for this project. While it also wonders, what does designing look like if we're not allowed to buy sort of new things? What if we just have to kind of deal with everything that we have? And how might designing through a client look like in this kind of post-commodity context? Thanks. How's everyone doing? Okay-ish? Do we need this guy? No? Yes.
Can you hear us if we just speak like that? Is it okay? Is the mic picking it up? I don't think we all need to wear a mic, do we? Yeah.
Oh.
Those.
Maybe we can lean in.
Do you want to switch so you can be on the mic?
Yeah, that's good. Well, all right. I think we can begin. First of all, thank you both for the work that you have presented. That's really quite a provocative set of things for us to look at. One of the things I heard both of you talk about in different ways, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about, is in different ways this idea of transforming existing conditions or found conditions that could be existing forms, existing materials, existing assemblages, existing spaces, existing processes, and how your work in some sense takes this on and then transforms it. And that could be through a reorganization. It could be through a resurfacing, through an intervention of some kind, a circularity, right? A kind of revisiting in order that it could again be revisited comes into it. It seems to me that in doing that, in approaching, in having your work approach existing conditions in this way, in part it's about, let's say, heightening awareness of something that might not be obvious, and it's implicitly a critique of those existing conditions. And if we see it in that way, I think what I'd like to hear a little bit more from both of you about is how do we then assess the effectiveness of that critique? What should we look at in your work in order to understand is the critique in some way effective? Are we taking from it what you hope we will? How do we understand it in that way?
I mean, I think in my work, the sort of the baseline approach is to assume that a kind of immediate and available cultural observation is very valid. So I think in some way, as much as like using an immediate resource, like a 2x4 over and over, the idea of referencing something that both like me or like both like you, the students, like kind of like experience or like see in their like recurring in their daily lives over and over is like is something needed to like be point to. So in some way, I think the only valid way to measure that is if then that kind of audience can relate to it as a form of visual or material kind of representative of that particular like subtopic. So if somebody like beyond architecture can understand the kind of the shape of the crates as a kind of critique on the unitization of all measurements, I would think that that's the measure of that particular work. Mm-hmm. I don't know how that looks. I don't know what the actual representation of that is.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Ellen, what do you think?
Yeah. So the question is how do we measure the effectiveness? I think that's very interesting because I start with measuring things and understanding, but the end product I really don't care. That's maybe that's why I can just.
I like that.
Yeah, because it's because that's. Otherwise, it becomes too restrictive, I think, if I start caring about if it's going to work or not, because otherwise it will limit creativity, at least in terms of in types of things that I do. So, but it's very interesting, actually, that question, is because I completely start with measuring things, understanding things, but where it ends up, it's kind of it has a very logical process, but within its within its fluidity also. So it's but I don't really say, okay, this is measuring the sounds of the police communication, but if somebody doesn't understand that, it doesn't matter at all. So it's about, that's a starting point, that's what I'm doing, but to really understand, to make them really understand, at that point I just don't care. I don't know if that's a bad thing, or maybe that's my process, I guess. But yeah, it's because that's how it. I can also experiment, because there are experiments. Because if I say, okay, I need to measure this outcome. Because it touches on, I said I don't call myself an artist, it touches on art, some of the work that I do. So when I start measuring all that, it becomes a bit of a self-restrictive, I think. From, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how exactly, I mean, yeah, maybe you can tell like some of the origin stories or some of the like biography like kind of plays into that, where I have like, everything starts from an audience-driven practice, like doing sort of scenography and scenography systems. So even though I'm in this sort of like game of systems, it's always a kind of audience or culture at large that is the thing to be roped in ultimately, or the thing that I'm having a conversation with, or interested in having a conversation with. So I see the objects as like not completely influenced by by what they might look like at the end from the origin, but the measure of their success for me is whether they can be like totems of that conversation, like very, very obvious proxy objects of a conversation that might be happening among people. So yeah, like.
Right.
Do you see your approaches as being in some way in conflict in that regard, or are they more alike than different?
Well, I just
very
want to
few
add,
things between us that would be in
want to say
conflict.
something. It's a comment. This was I never knew logistics could be poetic, and this was the most poetic logistics I've ever seen. So, which is So it's I didn't know that. So, I think I just wanted to say that. But yeah.
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Say something else.
So I think my question is more to Lida, and probably it's like 2 parts. Maybe it's not a question at all.
I'll be here.
I think I'm really fascinated by this idea of using and abusing in your words, which is related to the idea of, buying materials and then using them and then abusing the return policy, the 90 days return policy to actually get something done with less cost and less kind of accumulation of trash, which is a good thing to do and a good approach to sustainability, and which kind of reminds me to, like with Kellen Easterling's words about cheating and cheaters and believers, I think it was the text, which is like you have to cheat in order to do good somehow within this current climate of really powerful infrastructure that we already have in our society. And so I wonder, how can we think about this in relation to larger frameworks that already exist in the sharing economy and circular economy, of how things are always in a movement and circulating, and how that plays out in. As long as the object is good, we can keep using it forever. And look at the same time at our living style and how we are always constantly in movement in a similar way as the object itself. So I think that might not be a question, but maybe. And then the other part is, since like in your work, you take this idea of the circulation and then you design, you put together these designs that are what you call kits and pieces and parts that get assembled together. I think I see here, as you might be saying, is that the role of the architect is to design, is essentially reduced down to maybe designing some parts and putting a constellation of materials together.
Yeah, or drawing in like good contacts that can do other parts of that system, which is ultimately a lot of what architecture is, right? Like in some way, like sourcing the right materials from the right person, or the right kind of lineage of material making, like the structural system, right? Like without the structural system, everything else is not quite a thing. That's what makes it a thing, makes it structural. But I think, to the question of user and abuser, in some way, like I get asked this question a bit about like. I think people find a bit of like potentiality in that sort of like sliver of agency that is to like be a cheater within a system that like makes like very much kind of like not cheaters out of all of us, in some way, because we're, whatever. There's a lot of things that we just don't have agency or domain to inflict any kind of change onto, or so we're told. And so I get this question a lot, and I think I always want to be really honest that if I'm presenting If I'm presenting like on those three things, on like rentals, like returning and resurfacing, is probably because like those are the only three places in which I was able to find a small sliver of agency and a kind of mini loop within the kind of larger loop. So I just kind of like create like a mini loop that might or might not be filled with contradictions and or trade-offs, right? Like I trade in my labor, my time in order to gain economic access to these materials. And or when, you know, and that the return project kind of has a hard time like translating into a shipping return project, because then you engage all of this kind of environmental implications. So it's very, very limited, right? Like the realms in which you can be a cheater. Or they're very, very big and we know their names and last names, you know, and those are realms in which only a few have a privilege to kind of function within that level of cheating. In our world, they're very, very, very small. So if I'm presenting them, it's probably because I like, you know, like I'm pretty happy that I was able to find them, and so now I'm like presenting them. So the reason why I bring it up that way is because people are like, what else? What else is there? Well, like, what else we can cheat about? You know, like, what other architectural project can I do that it's like, I'm like, I don't know, like one of those three. That's all I got. like that's all I've got. I mean, but for me, it's like it's really biographical. Like it comes from being like a 16-year-old who was like putting shows together on like 3 scrappy pieces, and you know, like that. You know, I was putting on like 4 shows a month and needed to use the same material, so it made a kind of like rascally punk like out of me, and I keep that into architecture.
If I may, I'd like to pick up on this question of agency. You know, where it is that we can kind of effectively act, and it seems to me, again, with both bodies of work, it would seem that we have, as designers, as architects, that one of our principal forms of agency is in that of the translator. That much of what we're doing is sort of literally as well as metaphorically translating ideas, thoughts, processes from one realm into a different realm. And that translation, I would argue, is never without friction of some kind. As is true in linguistic translation, something is gained and something is lost. The meaning is never quite the same. And I've picked up on that in both bodies of work. And I wonder if maybe, Ellen, you could start and just say a little more about how you see your role as a translator. Perhaps talk a little bit about the role of friction that might play into your work.
Yeah, I think in translation is the exact word I think to use for the types of things that I do. It's yeah, I couldn't find a better way of describing between translation and friction. This is really good. Basically what I'm doing is, my work is about, again, translating these either the unseen qualities or some phenomenon in the environment to a new way of seeing or revealing and by doing that, creating some sort of an engagement in the space. And when you say frictions, I think it's all about that, right? It's everything from the social, political, economic, technical. All these are everything comes into play, and it's like. And that's where designers and architects thrive in, right? I mean, this is what we do best, is to take all these different frictions and to create some and make our playground, basically. That's what it is. It's just we play with these frictions, and then to come up with some new way of seeing things, or a new way of understanding things, or a new way of even being together or living. So I think, yes, I think that really distills the work. It's between translation and friction. I completely see that.
I see it. I see mine a lot more as a kind of like reduction or something. Like when you're cooking, like. Because in some way, like even the way I sort of like do research or something, like I see all this excess, and then I in some way I kind of like boil it down into like reduce it into kind of like this single kind of either totemic objects or like this one single system in some way. And I feel like at the end, like there's something like rather than something that creates friction, they always end up being almost like more like cliches, like very specific reductions of like, if you took like an entire year of like, you know, Google searches about like UPS and like reduced them to like a box, like it's maybe in some way what I'm trying to design. So I don't know if that makes it frictionless, but in some way it makes it like there, like, yeah, like so, also there.
So do you see what you're doing in some way as I mean, to frame it this way, would it be fair to say that what you're doing in a sense is you're contending with friction that exists, but you're somehow working to eliminate it or kind of, as you say, distill or reduce to something that is essential. And yet it seems to me that it's necessary to engage those so-called frictions on the way to what you're showing.
Yeah, definitely. I always describe it as like essentially I make work about my demons. Like I think I find logistics brutal, like personally and on the planet and on like sort of on everything. Everything is too much, like right, like we can't even, our schedules, like all this stuff. So then I make work about that. So yeah, I think the friction comes in at the beginning. A kind of that's a great observation. I'm gonna use that.
Please do.
Thanks.
Should we open to the audience if you?
Yeah.
Jacob's got a question.
I guess to follow up then on Mike's question, like, and to go back to where Alan you ended and where you, Lydia, started, where do you see yourselves then in the roles? Are you the translator and are you the reducer, or do you see yourself more than that? Or where do you find yourself fitting into these roles?
Well, now I'm like reducer and abuser. So I don't know. We're gonna have to update the charts of the designer. Yeah, I see myself as kind of like maybe like cultural reducer that then kind of attempts to like translate it into kind of an architecture somehow. So very much a designer in that translating end.
Yeah, as I mentioned when I showed the picture, I like the blurriness of it. That it wasn't the categories. It wasn't very clear. So there was something nice about that because as much as we want to define and specialize, and I think there's something about us as designers, and we need to be able to. I mean, we thrive by being in hybrid environments, basically, right? I mean, that's how we design best. I think designers thrive in hybridity. That's what it is. So in that sense, I have that tension always in like this schizophrenic way of being. Basically, I like to say, oh, I'm this, but then no, I completely change. And but I don't lose sleep over it anymore. Right? That's the thing. So like, I'm fine with it. So it just, I think it's good to say what you do, but at the same time, in my opinion, and this is very subjective, and part of it is my ADD, maybe, right? I don't like to do the same thing over and over. I just so it's there is that. It's very personal, but there is something for me at least to be okay to say I do this, but then I can just branch out and do other things. That's how I I like being.
Others?
No.
Yeah.
This one, Martin, go
I
ahead.
have a question for Alan. I thought it was interesting when you said you kind of lose interest.
Sorry, I can't hear you well.
Speak up, speak
Speak
up.
up.
So I thought it was interesting when you were mentioning that you kind of don't care about the end product, or you kind of lose interest in the project at that point. And it got me wondering, like, what you consider the end product to be.
I didn't say I don't care about the end product. I don't care about how to measure the success of the end product. So I do care. So I start with something. I do care that I want to do it as best as possible within the time frame, within the constraints. I become very obsessive about it, but not about measuring the outcome per se, basically. So that's. I don't know if I answered your question. Had two parts, maybe. Or?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, like, you were kind of like wondering, maybe if you have an idea of what the end product is going to be while you're working on the project, or is it like more of like a data collection thing with some projects and others, more like these device that you're kind of creating a smart materials approach?
I never know what the end product is. I have some sort of an idea that, okay, this is where it needs to be, but it's always like adjusting while you're going, basically, because, again, it's never a completely top-down approach. So you don't say, okay, because I never do the same thing again over and over. So it's each project is completely new materials, new type of thinking. So it has some components of it. So in that sense, every project is an experiment. So there's no way of knowing that it's going to be exactly that. You have a certain idea, you're going in that direction, but you have to adjust as you go and make deadlines happen and work within constraints of the real world and all that fun stuff.
I wonder, Martin, if I could pick up on your question and maybe ask Lida to speak a little bit about your perception of an end product in your work. I mean, you speak so much about circularity and sort of revisiting, and then again we revisit and we come back. And what is there now?
Endless?
Sorry?
Endless, maybe?
It's endless.
Yeah, it does feel endless. Or it's starting to feel endless with the sort of newer project. What does an end product look like? I think like when the end product to me feels when the system is somehow tight, and sometimes I don't really know what that means. Maybe that I'm not making conceptual escapes from the project. That like I am doing exactly what I'm saying I'm doing. Or that, for example, like with this like new like some parts project, like that I can make it work as a business, potentially, like that I can train myself to be enough of a business person to be able to handle it. So like those are all part of like working on the system itself rather than any one given of those images that I showed today. So my preoccupations any given day, or what I really measure about the project, is like not really anything of what I showed. It's like all in emails, really.
That's very interesting to learn about the process of how.
Yeah.
Go on. I just wanted to help them expand perhaps the idea of measuring success. Maybe we can translate it into the idea of participation. Both of your works participate in public realm in one way or in the other. It's an interpretation, translation. Yours, quite literally, it's a public art installation. It partakes in the making of the public realm. Yours, the critique is operative, semi-operative, and the discourse itself that you present is participating. But what are other ways that you see where you do participating in the making of the world, and whether it's political, socio-spatial, or simply economically, your operation? Have you thought of does it economically change when you participate? Or whatever it might be, even like with the Physics Institute, right?
Right.
It is, but how is it that it participates in the making of the idea of the new institute?
Right. I'm just thinking, I think, I mean, if you frame it like that, the question, obviously, I do, when I said I don't care about measuring, I do care about engagement of, or transformation of a place, or making the institute again, right? So I do care about these types of goals. But to try to quantify it somehow or measure, that's what I meant. I don't, but of course it has every project has a goal, and that's why I said I don't call myself an artist. So it's not that I do care about the end product in a way where it engages, but not necessarily to a way where I can measure how it. So I guess that's what I wanted to make clear also, yeah. So I don't know if I answered your question. But,
yeah,
well,
I suppose participates by.
I mean, I think about the sort of first line of consequence of the kind of economic models that I'm proposing a lot in terms of what is it having like a labor consequence, for example, right? Like the return process has a labor consequence, the shipping return has a much more environmental consequence, but as we see in this kind of Amazon warehouses, an incredible labor consequence. Or the rental one, right? Specifically, just because that's the one that I'm thinking about more recently, has an incredibly regional effect. So it's kind of like its audience, its immediate radius of affecting the object of measure. If we say that that's the human or the human and the economic model sort of tied together, it's got an incredibly regional proposal, this kind of wedding tent or architecture that in intermediate scale. It's not furniture, it's not building, but it's somewhere, and it's somewhere between a system and an object. And I don't think I have it figured out, but I've recently arrived at this word about it insists on a kind of regionality, on having a limited radius, and therefore potentially insisting on what I never thought I would be advocating for, which is a more localized nature of the project. I mean, I don't know, being a hyper international child, all of a sudden I found myself in the Midwest advocating for a regional project. That's, yeah. So I didn't know that was the goal of the project. It was definitely not where the measure of, or what are we saying? The kind of what I thought it was going to be at the beginning. And yet that's where it ended. So somehow, yeah, a regional connotation to the economic model is what I'm struggling with, or it's what I'm borrowing at the moment from the project.
Yeah, also, let's go back, because your work has all these, cheating, abusing, and all these, things, using, even, taking bad things like consumerism and all these, habits that we have. And then even, your new project is about commodity and post-commodity. You call it post-commodity, and I think you talked about the building being as a commodity, a constellation of products.
Yeah.
And you taking that idea and you are actually working with it, because for instance, we talk about the building as a commodity, as a negative thing, and you're taking that idea and you're working with it in a you're trying to do good behind that maybe negatively perceived idea. So I just wonder, where do you see your work going? Does this, for instance, have any urban scale interpretations in your mind that you could work with it in the future? Because as long as I'm familiar with your work, it's mostly working on the interior. So I wonder, how do you see yourself going, taking this like post-commodity idea?
I think that's why I always, that's why more recently I engage everything as a business model, because I'm a solo practice and I seem to have limited myself to the interior because that's the kind of scale that I can scope my head around. The urban scale has always seemed too much. Even the building has always seemed too much or too long or too slow or too something. So I engage the business model because there's multipliers embedded in it. So essentially one thing times 50,000 is one way of affecting change. That is, to me, much more relevant right now than one building attempting to kind of do good, right? Because the multiplier is involved. So in some way, changing how IKEA assembles furniture would be potentially much more, or how everybody but IKEA potentially assembles furniture could be much more relevant, or how we do every farmer's market, or how we, so I think that's why I focus on this kind of system-based, multiplier-based. So that's where I find scale. It's not interior to urban, it's something times how many times.
Sure, yeah, that's absolutely.
Anyone in the audience with it?
Mary
has a question.
Lyda, I was hoping to talk more about the term post-commodity. The idea of changing skins or the aesthetic to have a new use would seem to fit with a post-Fordist sort of customization. But then when I think commodity, I think the sameness of the unit. And then seeing the image is the sameness of the texture, and I can sort of see commodity in there, but I'm wondering what's the post?
Yeah, it's just it's a new term, and it's riddled with contradictions, and I'm glad you're bringing it up, because I don't use post as post anything. It's very much always kind of during for me, as commodification is happening, but I'm also kind of using it as a cheeky way to point to post comfort, commodity as comfort driven objects that there might be a time that is so commodities to me have been equated with comfort and efficiency. If you get some of these things, life will be more streamlined, things will be better, so in some way, if we eliminate that, the result of that room might be post-comfort in a way, post-commodity, because it's not necessarily how we like to occupy rooms, not necessarily how we like to look at furniture, not necessarily, but at the same time, it exists within a world of that has set up as a kind of preamble, okay, what if we can't make any more stuff? So it's the post-commodity comes from post-new commodity. What if it's post-new commodity? I don't know. It might be almost too cheeky of a word, where I can't undo all the knots that I embedded into it.
Apply also to post-human ideas, because it is kind of not so comfortable for human occupancy, as you said, and
I related a bit to a kind of a current conversation that's very much ongoing at Michigan about the post-digital, which is essentially not post digital, not after digital, but essentially once digital has become ubiquitous, once we are no longer fascinated by what it can do and it's just kind of creeping everywhere, then what then? That's a new condition. So it's post-Fordist, or it's post commodity, but it's also during it, but that during is
like-
still a new condition. So like the ubiquitous
Or maybe use-
commodity as a, yeah.
Using it at its max, or like
Yeah, like as a kind of, some kind of peak moment
Yeah.
of it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of untying to do in all of the posts, I guess is really what I'm saying. And I'm borrowing some of the problems of that rhetoric not having been completely like untangled.
I wonder if, to pick up on this, the thread, and also to revisit a question or an issue which I've heard you address, the question of labor,
Yeah.
right, within the work. And I think both bodies of work, I think we could talk about labor. And as an architect and as an academic, I've always been struck by this sort of dual nature of our work, that it is, in a sense, at least it can be seen in a sense as instrumental. That is, that the work that we produce as architects is in some way in service to something else happening. In other words, I don't necessarily build the building, I draw the instructions, let's say. But the work itself that we produce obviously always has a sort of critical dimension in and of itself. A building need not be built. I mean, we need not be drawing a building in order for the thing to be sort of relevant to us in our work as architects and as academics. I'm wondering, Alan, I was thinking particularly of the project that you showed, the Familiar Strangers project in Calgary, and I think I heard you mention, I may have misunderstood, but I think I heard you mention that the work itself, the installation is not yet complete, and that what you were showing us on the screen was essentially test implementation of it, right? And so what you're doing at this sort of suspended moment in time before the thing comes into its own existence, what you rely on in order to sustain the conversation about it is, in essence, a sort of prototype or a sort of prediction of what the thing will be. So again, I'm just kind of fascinated across the spectrum of the two bodies of work. Where do you kind of fall on this issue of the labor of the architect, the sole practitioner, or the member of the team, or the right? Where does your work lie on that spectrum?
So in Familiar Strangers, that was a on-site, basically, demo. That I guess I'm trying to understand the question. When you say the labor is the architect.
Yeah. So we all create work, right? And we're working, let's say, on our own, and to different degrees, that work can be again translated or used by others in order to, let's say, affect something else. So if I'm orchestrating a kind of installation to be built in the city, I may not actually be doing the welding myself.
I see,
right?
I see. Right.
Someone else is doing it. But at the same time, I can create, I mean, for example, some of the work that you were showing, the work that you create as a sole practitioner is itself the critical artifact, right? It's not necessarily instrumental to something else. And so I'm observing that there are differences. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about where you see yourself on that kind of spectrum.
So I guess for me, probably I'm on the middle. So if there is, in terms of so if there's the architect who just draws things and gives it to the contractor, and the contractor builds it, and so there's that, and then there's the person who is actually sculpting things and building on site. So that's on the other side of the spectrum. So my work falls somewhere in the middle in terms of, because a lot of times I need to go do on-site tests and installations and prototypes. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. Yeah, so it's, and then a lot of times also, I mean, It varies. So it's a continuum basically from I guess completely delegating some of the works, and some of it is you have to do basically with your hands. So that's and depending on the type of projects, obviously the last project that I showed, it's going to be completely going into the architect mode, basically drawing things but pulses, for example, the one in New York we did it in the studio basically. We tried all sorts of. We transformed the whole studio into. So it varies. So there's no and I like the flexibility, doing things very hands-on and stepping back and looking at the big picture. And while I'm saying this, I'm not sure if I understood your question.
No, I think you have.
All right.
I mean, really what I'm hoping to do is to find,
Right,
you
yeah.
know, I'm trying to draw some sort of connective tissue, right, between what I'm seeing in the two presentations. And so maybe Lyda could also respond.
I think what I realized in your question is that like this idea that I kind of do this like businesses, I'm now like always proposing these businesses, is that it allows me to think about it in the third person, like, you know, in some way, like that's what that does, as opposed to that's what I do, which would be a kind of maybe a very different answer. There's an incredibly labored aspect of the work that has always been incredibly inefficient and has never thought about myself as the actually translator. It has always been source of the work, but it's like engaged with a kind of like imaginary conversation with like 5 cultural producers around the world that are represented by the internet in my world. Then I rarely ever sort of draw anything because I don't need to translate it to anybody because I don't really have a team. I make everything myself. And therefore it goes straight into prototype or straight into a phone call, industry phone call, to see if they will collaborate and make the sticks green. So it's emails, it's not drawings, it's emails plus ideas, information equals prototype equals plus logistics equals installation or equals like a thing. Whereas now in the business model, because I get to see it in the third person, I get to see the own inefficiencies of my own personal sort of business, and I get to kind of control those. So for the kit, I'm spending now a lot of time in developing like a YouTube-based set of instructions, so that essentially the labor can be offset of the like assembling of the kit. So I arrive, I drop it off, or somebody arrives, drops it off, and you put it together, right? Which is what we all know IKEA completely monetized. The kind of instructions are given to you, and therefore you are the labor of your own furniture. That has made their own business model incredibly streamlined. They just make the parts, right? So I'm in trying to implement. I think maybe that's, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
So, yeah. We've been advised to sort of complete our discussion by 5:30. There's a lecture afterwards, but I want to thank our panelists and moderators. Sorry to be like a totalitarian dictator.
But smiling, you're smiling.
But it's smiling.
Yeah,
the
yeah.
conversation will continue, hopefully, as we wrap this up.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks for staying.